For decades, crossing Africa by air has meant one thing above all else: planning. Fuel stops, weight limits, range calculations. No margin for error. So when reports surfaced of a self-powered aircraft traveling across the continent, without the usual dependence on fuel, the reaction wasn't excitement. It was disbelief. Because Africa isn't an easy test. It's vast. It's varied. And it exposes every weakness in aviation systems. Yet this aircraft didn't move like a record attempt. It moved like a journey. No dramatic takeoff footage. No celebratory countdowns. Just a quiet departure, followed by a trail of data points that slowly stretched across maps that were never meant for fuel-free flight. What made this journey different wasn't speed or altitude. It was consistency. Leg after leg, the aircraft maintained stable performance without the familiar pattern of energy depletion. No anxiety over the next refueling location. No visible urgency to land. The flight profile looked less like a race against range and more like a conversation with distance itself. Observers noticed something unusual early on. The aircraft didn't hug optimized routes the way fuel-dependent planes do. It wasn't obsessed with efficiency corridors or emergency alternates. Its path appeared flexible. That flexibility raised questions. Because in aviation, flexibility usually costs energy. Here, it didn't seem to. As the aircraft crossed deserts, coastlines, and highlands, its behavior remained unchanged. No dramatic adjustments. No compensating thrust. No evidence of the system being strained by environmental shifts, which suggested the power source, whatever its nature, wasn't being consumed. It was being accessed. That distinction matters. Consuming energy means running out. Accessing energy means endurance becomes a function of alignment, not storage. And Africa, with its extreme contrasts, became the perfect proving ground. Wind patterns shifted. Temperatures swung. Atmospheric density changed. Yet the aircraft didn't respond like a machine under pressure. It responded like a system in equilibrium. Those tracking the journey began to realize this wasn't about a single aircraft proving it could fly. It was about demonstrating persistence. Because one successful takeoff can be dismissed. One controlled landing can be questioned. But a journey, especially across a continent, forces a different kind of conversation. Some analysts began comparing the flight to early maritime navigation. When sailors stopped hugging coastlines and trusted open water, it wasn't because ships suddenly got faster. It was because their relationship with navigation changed. This aircraft appeared to be doing something similar with energy. Instead of carrying everything it needed, it relied on conditions being present wherever it went. That approach doesn't just change range, it changes philosophy. And that philosophy started to show in how the journey unfolded. There were no emergency landings, no visible system fatigue, no gradual loss of performance. If anything, the flight became more confident as it progressed, as though distance itself was no longer an obstacle, but a neutral factor. That's when the implications began to sink in. If an aircraft can traverse Africa without fuel dependency, then traditional constraints, cost, infrastructure, logistics, begin to loosen. Remote regions stop being endpoints and start becoming waypoints. Because once flight is no longer chained to fuel availability, geography loses its power to isolate. Airstrips that were once impractical suddenly matter again. Regions written off as unreachable begin to re-enter the map, not as destinations of last resort, but as part of a continuous network. And Africa, more than any other continent, reveals what that shift truly means. Vast distances where infrastructure thins out. Communities separated not by oceans, but by logistics. Skies that have always been open, yet economically restricted. As the aircraft continued its journey, observers noticed that the stops, when they happened, weren't dictated by necessity. They were deliberate. Planned pauses rather than forced landings. That distinction changed how people interpreted the route. This wasn't endurance flight pushed to its limits. It was movement without urgency. And that calmness was unsettling. Because aviation usually advertises its limits openly, remaining fuel, remaining range, remaining options. Here, those metrics didn't define behavior. The aircraft didn't act like it was managing scarcity. It acted like scarcity wasn't part of the equation. That raised a deeper question. If energy is no longer the bottleneck, what becomes the new constraint? Navigation? Regulation? Human readiness to trust what they're seeing? As the journey progressed, attention quietly shifted from the aircraft to the systems around it. Ground coordination appeared minimal. There was no visible trail of support convoys or fuel logistics following the route. The usual backbone of long-distance aviation simply wasn't there, which suggested the journey wasn't being supported in the traditional sense. It was being enabled. That difference matters. Support keeps something alive. Enablement lets it move freely. And freedom of movement is what made this flight across Africa so disruptive. Because if an aircraft can operate independently of fuel infrastructure, then air mobility stops being centralized. It decentralizes. It adapts to local conditions instead of forcing local conditions to adapt to it. For regions long excluded from reliable air transport, that shift isn't theoretical. It's transformational. But this wasn't framed as a humanitarian showcase. There were no speeches, no declarations, just distance being crossed again and again without the usual costs showing up on the ledger. And with every additional stretch of sky behind it, the journey made something harder to ignore. That attention, once earned, doesn't stay confined to the sky. It spreads outward into policy rooms, engineering circles, and places where decisions are made slowly and cautiously. Because endurance forces accountability. A short flight can be dismissed as coincidence. A long one invites explanation. As the aircraft moved deeper across the continent, the data trail grew harder to ignore. Flight stability remained consistent. No visible degradation. No escalating intervention. Each new segment quietly reinforced the same message. Whatever was powering this journey wasn't being used up. That realization unsettled traditional models. Aviation planning is built around decline, fuel burn curves, maintenance cycles, fatigue thresholds. This flight didn't fit that narrative. It suggested a system that behaves more like infrastructure than a consumable machine. And infrastructure changes how we think. You don't ask a road how far it can go. You ask where it connects. That's how this journey began to look. Not like an aircraft proving its endurance, but like a moving corridor forming in real time. A pathway defined not by fuel stops, but by environmental compatibility. Observers noticed that the aircraft's performance didn't peak and fade. It plateaued. It settled into a rhythm. That kind of behavior implies design intent, because systems that plateau are built to persist. And persistence carries consequences. If flight becomes persistent rather than consumptive, then planning shifts from scarcity management to access optimization. Routes are chosen for connectivity, not refueling. Aircraft become platforms rather than payloads. As this idea spread, skepticism didn't disappear, but it evolved. The question was no longer, did it happen? It became, what does this allow next? And that question doesn't have a small answer. Because once a self-powered aircraft crosses Africa, it doesn't just redraw air routes. It challenges assumptions about who gets to design them, who gets to benefit from them, and who gets left waiting on the ground. The journey wasn't announced as historic, but history rarely announces itself. It reveals itself slowly, through patterns that refuse to break, through systems that keep working when they're expected to fail. And as this aircraft continued forward, one quiet truth followed it across every mile of sky. And once the world begins to notice, something subtle changes. Silence gives way to curiosity. Curiosity turns into scrutiny. Not the loud kind, no headlines yet, no official endorsements, but the careful kind. The kind that studies patterns instead of statements. The kind that waits to see if consistency breaks. It didn't. As the aircraft continued its path, weather variations became unavoidable. Crosswinds over open plains. Thermal instability near equatorial zones. Pressure shifts over rising terrain. In conventional flight, these moments leave fingerprints, extra corrections, altered profiles, visible strain. Here, they barely registered. That steadiness forced observers to confront an uncomfortable idea. The aircraft wasn't compensating for conditions. It was operating with them, which suggests the system wasn't optimized for a narrow envelope of performance. It was designed for variability. That design philosophy is rare in aviation. Most aircraft are masterpieces of optimization, finely tuned for specific ranges, altitudes, and missions. This one behaved like something else entirely, less like a vehicle, more like a participant in a larger system. And that reframing changed how the journey was interpreted. Instead of asking how far the aircraft could go, analysts began asking where else the same conditions existed. Across Africa, across other continents, across routes long considered marginal or impractical. Because if the journey wasn't limited by onboard energy, then its true boundary wasn't distance. It was understanding. Understanding how to recreate the alignment. Understanding how to scale the configuration. Understanding how to integrate something that doesn't behave like anything before it. And that's where resistance quietly forms, not out of disbelief, but out of complexity. Systems that don't fit are harder to absorb than systems that fail. As the aircraft pressed on, it left behind more than a trail on a map. It left behind a question in every place it passed overhead. If this can move freely here, what else could? That question lingered long after the aircraft itself disappeared into the horizon, carried forward not by engines or fuel, but by the growing realization that movement, true movement, might no longer depend on what we carry with us. And that realization doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in slowly, like altitude gained without turbulence. Because once movement is no longer defined by consumption, progress stops looking like a countdown. There's no ticking gauge, no approaching limit. The journey becomes open-ended, not reckless, but unbounded. That's why the final legs of the aircraft's path were the most revealing. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. No emergency signals. No abrupt landings. No visible exhaustion of the system. In aviation, nothing happening is often the most telling result. By then, the focus had shifted again. Away from the aircraft, away from the route, and toward what comes after. Because a successful journey doesn't demand applause, it demands replication. And replication is where ideas stop being stories and start becoming structures. If the conditions that powered this aircraft can be recreated, then the journey across Africa wasn't a one-time event. It was a template. A demonstration of how flight could function when energy stops being a consumable resource and starts being an environmental interaction. That possibility unsettles long-standing hierarchies. Airspace control, fuel monopolies, infrastructure-dependent mobility. All of it assumes scarcity. Remove scarcity, and the map changes, not gradually but fundamentally. Which is why the most important part of this story still hasn't happened yet. It isn't the takeoff. It isn't the crossing. It isn't even the landing. It's the moment someone else attempts the same journey, not as a test, not as a spectacle, but as a normal operation. And that is where this journey truly concludes, not with a finish line, but with a change in perspective. Because crossing Africa without fuel dependency wasn't about proving endurance or defying expectations. It was about revealing a different relationship with movement.